Good day, everybody. Welcome back to Teaching Methods of English. In the last class, we didn't finish all the reading strategies. We covered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then we stopped at 9, but we did not start with 9. We began, but we didn't finish it. So we're just going to start with reading strategy 9 and finish that, and then start with what we have planned to cover in part 2 of a lesson. All right, so the ninth strategy that we are looking at is distinguishing between literal meaning and implied meaning. So this requires the application of sophisticated top-down processing skills, and that the fact that not all language can be interpreted appropriately by attending only to the literal meaning, like focusing on the words, the sentences, the paragraph basically, or like syntactic surfaces structure makes special demand on the reader. So that is not to say that sometimes we need the top-down processes to get the implied meaning. All right, the literal meaning is like what the sentence really says, what is explicitly said. Implied meaning usually has to be driven from the processing pragmatic information. And here we're going to look at some of the examples. When we're talking about pragmatic, it's the usage of context, seeing the relationship between what the ideas that are being said and the users, and you use the context to get the meaning. And the context could be a cultural context. It could be also just relying on background knowledge to understand what the speaker or what is saying, or what has been written, right? So here we've got an example. The first example is Bill walked into a frigid classroom and immediately noticed Bob sitting by the open window with a heavy sweatshirt on. All right, sweatshirt is like a jersey. Brr, he explained, simultaneously eyeing Bob and the open window. It's sure cold in here, Bob. Bob glanced up from his book and growled, "Oh, all right, I'll close the window." So here in this discussion, you can see that Bill did not ask Bob to close the window directly. Do you get? But from his expression, Bob could get that what Bill is trying to say is for him to close the window. All right. We have another example. So the policeman held up his hand and stopped the car. So the usage of like hand held up for someone will understand that it means to stop. All right. And then we have got the third example. Mary heard the ice cream man coming down the street. She remembered her birthday money and rushed into the house. So there you have to use your top-down processing to understand what is happening here. All right. So there's an ice cream man coming down the street. It could be either on the bicycle or it could be an ice cream bus. Right. And then she remembered her birthday money and rushed into the house. So what does that mean? Do you get? So in each of the three examples that we have here, what is the implied information? So there you can have the conversation with your students or learners, what the implied meaning is. For some of it, I've already spoken about, like the window situation. And then here, holding up the hand, it's an indication of of a policeman holding up the hand. It means for the driver to stop. And then running, she remembered her birthday money. Mary remembered her birthday money when she heard the ice cream man coming down the street. So what does that mean exactly? And then here, so the question is now, how would you help your learners to recognize the indirect requests that are made without forming a question? All right. So in the cases of Bill and then the policeman. All right. The effect of a policeman's hand signal. All right, for example, and then what the reader thinks will happen next. For example, in the third example of Mary. So what will happen next? You could ask your learners. So she remembered her birthday money and then she ran into the house. So what will happen next? And then here we've got also a surprise ending of number 3, and locked the door. And locked the door. So, your learners could have a discussion around the, implied meaning within the sentences that have been said. All right. So yeah, those are examples of like implied and literal meaning that you could be used as a way or a strategy for learners to use when they're reading. And then next we've got number 10, capitalize on discourse markers to process relationship. We've spoken a little bit about discourse markers in the previous lesson. And here, many discourse markers in English signal relationship among ideas as expressed through phrases, clauses, and sentences. A clear comprehension of such markers can greatly enhance learners' reading efficiency. And we have already spoken in a previous lesson that discourse markers really do signal, they indicate the relationship that are amongst the ideas that are expressed in the reading, either through phrases, could be clauses, or even full sentences. The table below enumerates almost 100 of these markers with which learners of intermediate proficiency level ought to be thoroughly familiar with. All right, so here we've got a number of them. I'll say that you must read them with time, and then you should know about them, because in the syllabus you are expected to know this, and you're expected to teach the learners some of these markers. So we have got enumerative markers, so the notional meaning, and then how do they look like. So, and then they even explain what they mean. So introduce order in which points are to be made, or the time sequence in which action or processes took place. So this is how you do that, mentioning the order. All right, enumerating the order of points of how they are mentioned. So secondly, first, third, first, second, third, or thirdly, firstly, secondly, thirdly. All right, so make time to go through those. And then we have got additive. Additive, so reinforcing, introducing reinforcement or confirming of what has been preceded. So that's how you do it. And similarity, introducing statement of similarity with what has been preceded. You understand? So this is really good, not only for your learners, also for you when you are doing your own actual writing. These are good to know. And then transition, so introducing a new stage in the sequence of presentation of information. So this is how you do it. And then we have got logical sequence. Summative, introducing summary of what had been what has preceded, what had been said. All right. And then resultative, introducing an expression of the results or consequences of what preceded. So, and includes inductive and deductive acts. So as a result, do you understand? So that's what we have there. Explicative, introducing an explanation or reformulation of what had preceded, namely. So that's what we have there. And then illustrative, introducing an illustration or example of what had preceded, for example. And then contrastive, and then replacive, so introducing an alternative of what preceded. So this is how you do it. So this is really like intermediate and advanced, and it's good to teach your learners so that they really become fluent, and when they go to the university they are like really advanced. All right. Antithetic, introducing formation in opposition of what had preceded. All right, so that's what we have. Concessive, introducing formation that is unexpected in the view of what had preceded. So that's what you say. And then instead of like using these words like concessive, antithetic, replacive, you could always just use the introduction here of what it does, what the discourse marker does, rather than this vocabulary that the learners might not understand. The idea is just for them to know what they mean, all right, and then how to use them. All right, because we have spoken about grammar, like, the terms that you use in the grammar lesson, how to teach grammar, that it's not so much about the terms, but it's the meaning of what these new terms that you are teaching your learners, as well as how to use them correctly. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the strategies. Reading comprehension strategies. Now we are moving on to what we have originally planned to teach in the second part of teaching reading. So in this part, we are going to look at the types of classroom reading performance, and then the reading principles that you have to employ when you are teaching reading. So the types of classroom reading performance. Different kinds of reading performance in the language classrooms are derived from the variety of text to which you can expose your learners, then from the variety of the type of performance. So here we have got some performance types of performance that you can encounter in the language classroom. So we have got classroom reading performance. All right, we have got the oral. So this is the reading out loud, and then we have got the silent reading, and then within the silent reading we have got intensive reading, and then we've got extensive reading. What does intensive reading really concentrate on? It focuses on linguistic and content, while extensive reading focuses mainly on like skimming to get them an idea, scanning, and then just getting the global idea of what the text is about. All right, but we'll look at that in more details. Oral and silent reading. So occasionally you will have reason to ask your learners to read orally, like to read out loud. All right, and then at the beginning and intermediate levels, oral reading provides some advantages as well as disadvantages, and then we are going to look at some of these advantages and disadvantages of like reading out loud. So here on this side we have got the advantages. So why is it advantages for learners to read out loud? One, oral reading serves as an evaluative check on bottom-up processing skills. So bottom-up processing skills, focuses on words, pronunciation of words, phrases, clauses, and sentences like that's what, and literal meaning. Okay, and then it doubles as a pronunciation check as well. Okay, and then it adds some extra students' participation if want to highlight a certain short segment of a reading passage. So if there's something particular that you really want the learners to focus on within the reading, you could always use the oral or reading out loud. Okay. But then what are the disadvantages? So here we have 3 of them. Oral reading is not a very authentic language activity. I mean, in reality, when we are reading, we hardly do it orally. All right, we don't read out loud, so that's why they say it's not very authentic when it comes to video reading. Number 2, while one student is reading, other can easily lose attention, which is really true. Or if they are reading in turns, be silently rehearsing the next paragraph. I mean, if you have the learners reading out loud, instead of listening to what the others are reading or following the information that is present in the reading, they might be practicing their own parts. Do you understand? And then they will not be focusing on what the whole text is all about. And then the third disadvantage is it may have an outward appearance of student participation when in reality it's a mere recitation. So they're really not understanding what they are saying, but rather just reading out loud for the sake of reading out loud, and in this case reciting what is being read, but they don't really understand. Okay? So those are some of the things that you have to keep in mind. When do you then practice oral or reading out loud in the classroom? So it's up to you. So you have, but then when you are making this decision, think about the advantages and disadvantages. Now, for advanced learners at the advanced level, usually only advantage 3 can be gained by reading out orally. So when you really want to have them focus on a certain part of a reading text, then maybe you should read out loud. All right. As a rule of thumb, you want to use oral reading to serve as at least one of the above purposes. On the other hand, the disadvantages of too much oral reading also need to be considered when you ask your learners to read out loud. Silent reading, on the other hand, is essential in order for the learners to gain any speed of process. All right, so because we have told them already in the strategies before that if they want to concentrate on fluency, they don't need to read each and every word. So if you want them to read faster, then silent reading might be the good path to take. For extensive reading, for example, explained below, speed is usually an important factor. For intensive reading, learning to read silent may be of less importance, but still remains an ultimate goal. So even in intensive reading, we still need to have our learners to read silently. Okay. So when learners are reading on their own, what is the advantage of silent reading? We have looked at that. Can you teach students to read silently, or is this a skill they have to pick up with advancing proficiency? What is the advantage, or is there one, of helping learners to read without moving their lips as they read? So this is just for you to, like Classroom Connection, for you to think about, do you need to teach your learners how to read silently? I would say yes, it's necessary, so that they improve their fluency, they improve their speed at which they are reading. Number 2, intensive reading and extensive reading, which you will have when the learners are reading silently. So silent reading can be subcategorized in intensive reading into intensive reading and extensive reading. Intensive reading analogous to intensive listening, all right, so comparable to intensive reading, is usually a classroom-oriented activity in which learners focus on the linguistic or semantic details of the passage. So the content, all right, of the passage. Intensive reading often calls learners to pay attention to grammatical forms, all right. So the linguistic part, so grammatical form, discourse markers, and other surface structure details for the purpose of understanding the literal meaning, all right, implication, and the rhetoric relationship and the like. All right. So here we are focusing on the linguistic aspects of the text as well as the content, all right, at the literal meaning, like at the surface level, as also for implications, like inferences that they can also get from looking at these parts of the reading, linguistic or content, and then also as well as the rhetorical relationship that can be seen as they read the text. All right. As a zoom lens strategy of taking a closer look at the text, intensive reading also may be a content-related reading strategy initiated because of subject matter comprehension difficulty. A complex cognitive concept may be trapped inside the word of a sentence or a paragraph, and a good reader will then very slowly and methodically extract meaning. All right. So here I was spoken about the linguistic, and then here the content. So it's through the intensive reading that you get the learners really focus on the meaning of the word, of the context in which the word is used, especially if that word carries the meaning, so much of the meaning within the text. Then they will need to know this word, and it's through intensive reading that they get to use their strategies and skills to understand whatever word that might cause difficulty when they're reading. And then moving on, extensive reading is carried out to achieve general understanding as usually somewhat longer text. All right. When it comes to intensive reading, we you usually use fairly short texts, but then when it comes to extensive reading, they are longer texts usually. Most extensive reading is performed outside the classroom time. Extensive reading. All right. Pleasure reading is often extensive. All right. So that's where you also get the idea of like what is extensive. Pleasure reading. Pleasure reading is part of the extensive reading. Technical, scientific, professional reading can under certain special circumstances be extensive reading when one is striving for global or general meaning from the longer text. So when you want to get the general meaning or the global meaning of a longer text, it's usually part of the extensive reading. And then the advantage of extensive reading, we're discussing the first section of this chapter. By stimulating reading for enjoyment, or reading where all concepts, names, dates, and other details need not be retained, learners gain an appreciation of the effective and the cognitive window of reading, the entree into new world. So it's like an entrance to the new world. It's through extensive reading that they read pleasurably, and then they enjoy the reading. Do you understand? When they don't need to remember the details of what the text contains, things such as names, then they really do get to enjoy what they're reading. And then to introduce them to new world, like longer text, novels. Do you understand? You focus on extensive reading. That's why it's very advantageous. And then as we'll see later on, that it's through extensive reading that the learners can also build their vocabulary. Rather than just intensive, through extensive, they can also learn vocabulary. They can also learn different sentence structures. Do you understand? Clauses, how to use expressions. Is through extensive reading that this may happen the most as well. Extensive reading can sometimes help learners get away from their tendency of overanalyze, look up words they don't know, and read for understanding as engaged readers. So it's an advantage also to use extensive reading because it helps the learners to really move away from things like focusing on grammatical structures, focusing on certain vocabulary words, looking up these words, the definition and meaning. It's just like pleasurable, and then also to build on things like vocabulary, as I've mentioned earlier. Is through this when they are not worried about understanding every single word, but rather understand the global meaning of the reading. So that's what we have. So to conclude, basically what we're saying here is when it comes to reading in the classroom, the performance that the learners get to do is either reading out loud or reading in silence. And then we saw what are the advantages of reading out loud and then the disadvantage of reading out loud as well. And that's why you have to be very careful with how you go about reading out loud in the classroom. It shouldn't be an everyday practice when it comes to your performance that the learners are doing in the reading. That's why they advise as well the usage of the silent reading. And then when it comes to silent reading, they can do this when they are reading intensively or extensively. Intensively is when you are really focusing on a shorter text and then focusing on some linguistic aspects that you want them to focus on, as well as some content words, all right, or context as well of the reading text. And then we also have the extensive reading here. Now the extensive reading really helps the learners to get the general idea, the global meaning of a text, rather than focusing on what the intensive reading is all about. And then we have to encourage the learners to read extensively because it helps them really enjoy reading, because they will not need to focus on understanding each and every word, for example. And then they also get to enjoy reading when they don't need to remember specific information within the text. All right. And then extensive reading also helps them introduce them to new worlds. All right, it's through extensive reading because they read widely different topics as well. Okay, and then we also have to think about encouraging to read extensively without overanalyzing the text and also looking up each and every word. I think I've already mentioned that. So that's what we have there when it comes to the performance in reading. All right, now let's look at some of the principles for teaching reading and what are they. Number one, in an integrated course, you need to include a focus on reading skills. We have already mentioned some of the skills, the macro and the micro skills. You need to focus those in the classroom. So, although learners who are literate in their own language are sometimes left in their own devices when it comes to reading, when it comes to learning reading skills. It's easy for a teacher to assume that our learners will learn good reading simply by absorption through the generous offering of both intensive and extensive reading opportunities. Okay, so that is just to say that you cannot assume that through these practices of intensive and extensive reading they will absorb reading skills. No, that's not going to happen. You still need to focus on those. All right, you need to make them aware of these skills and then have them practice them over and over until they become the skills that they need as fluent readers. All right. In reality, there's much to be gained by the strategy focus on reading skills within the lesson that covers other skills. Even if it's integrative class, we need to have time to focus on the skill of reading itself, and also focusing on the skills that needs to help the learners be fluent readers. Virtually all courses materials include written word, so learners are reading even if their reading is incidental to other skills. So you could say that okay, the focus is so much on listening, but then when they are listening, before they start listening, there is the component of the reading that happens, like they need to read the instructions and the questions. But even in those incidental reading moments, you can inject focal moment in which learners attend to reading, like they really need to read. Rather than just listening, for example, at the instruction that you give them a written sheet of paper with instructions that they need to read on their own. So that is just to say that encourage the learners to read. Encourage the learners to read. And that could be done intensively or extensively. Next, offer reading on relevant, interesting, and motivating topics. So what do you think makes for interesting and relevant reading for your learners? So you have to ask yourself this question over and over, because it's not just about what topics you find interesting or motivating, or you assume that they're going to be motivating and interesting to the learners, but find out what are they interested in, and then bring those type of texts that you think that they will encounter, text topics that you think they will encounter on their daily basis, all right, in their daily lives, and topics that are related to their life goals. Do you understand? As young learners or young individuals that you're going to be working with. And then one approach to reading instruction is to have learners create their own material for reading. I mean, you could always ask them to bring in work or topics or reading texts that they are interested in, and then you will have a library of different reading texts that you can use in the classroom, and then if your school allows, and then you can make photocopies from those reading. It's from that list that you really know that they will bring something that they find interesting, and you could use that as long as it's exploitable. All right, if it's a text, and I think we'll talk about that, a text that will allow for exploitation either of language or structure, to understand within in its content. Other approaches in which learners are given choices in selecting reading materials offer the potential of increasing in their investment. I mean, when you really do ask them to bring different type of reading texts that they find interesting, then I mean they will be invested because they feel like they are contributing and not just being given what they should be focusing on. I feel like the world is changing. These kids have got interest, they have got goals, and they know their rights. They know way too much, and you can exploit that. You can, invest, or you can maximize, those interests and bring it into the classroom so that they also invest in what they are covering within the lesson. All right, careful sequence readings and instructional strategies that are success oriented gives personal involvement in the process. This is just to emphasize what has been said there. And then further reading that helps learners to form their respective identities should also help to bolster their sense of agency, like the importance of what they are covering in the classroom. Like, what are they interested in? I mean, kids want to be successful. They want to be seen as influencers. Do you understand? Bring in, such topics or reading texts that are related to that. Like, you can have a survey and then ask them what they're interested in. And then you can use that to inform you in choices of texts that you bring in the classroom. And then you mix it up with the one that are already assigned within the textbooks, and then to understand, just to involve them, to know that what they are doing, working on is related to their lives. Next, balance authentic and readability in choosing text. So what do we mean by this? There is this controversy that happens with the usage of simplified text. All right, and then there's also this conversation of like, then when we are using this text that we are using, how do we know that it's authentic? All right, how do we know it's an authentic text or if it's not an authentic text? All right, but then in order for you to make a decision on this issue of the simplified text, which is an otherwise authentic text that is edited to keep the language within the proficiency level of the learners, like, for you to really choose a text, let's say if it's really dense and it's very difficult, you can simplify it, but then it should still be an authentic text. And how do we make sure that the text still remain authentic even if it's simplified? First of all, you need to know the distinction between the simple text and simplified text to understand the sources of complexity in reading material. So authentic simple text can either be advised or located in the real world. All right, simple text. For example, you can get them from ads to labels to reports to essays. So these texts are available that are grammatically and lexically simple. They are very simple, but then they are still the type of text that you get from the real world. All right, and then simplifying an existing potential reading selection may not be necessary because the text in itself is already simple. Yet if simplification must be done, it's important to preserve the natural redundancy, the humor, the wit, and other captivating features on the original material. So for example, if it's really dense, as I've mentioned earlier, make sure that it still holds its authentic nature. All right, when it has like humorous sentences, then keep that in there. If it's like a very smart way of expression that has been used, then keep that in there. Whatever natural text structure that is in there, make sure that you still keep that in the text when you simplify it. Second, you might ask yourself what simplicity is, and then determine if a so-called simplified text is really simpler than its original. Sometimes simplified texts remove so much natural redundancy, all right, that they actually become very difficult, because now if you remove you simplify it, you might think that you have simplified. It might be that when you do that, the text become very difficult for the learners to really understand, and what you perceive as textual complexity might be more a product and a background schemata than a linguistic and complexity. All right, so when you, for example, simplify it, then maybe the aspect of of background knowledge that the learners can use. You might remove that, and then it makes it very difficult for the learners to really understand the text. So just be careful with that. All right. In light of this criteria, it's simplified text really simpler. The answer is no. When you take away anything that then natural redundancy, any natural structure or language that have been used that can then avoid or prevent the learners from, activating their schemata or relating to something that they already know. And then when you do that, then while you think that you have simplified the text, it might make it so much more difficult. So just be careful when you do this. But luckily, for most of the text that we use, we really don't need to simplify anything, because we are working with intermediate and very advanced learners within our lessons. So luckily, all right. And then we have got prescribed reading, but still, again, you can bring in texts that are of interest to our learners. Okay, so Natal offered 3 criteria for choosing reading text for your learners. So what type of text then do you have to use in the classroom? It's a text that is suitable of content. Material that the learners will find interesting, enjoyable, challenging, and appropriate for their goals in learning English. We already have got, so for example, for the higher level, they have got already a list of topics that you can use within your classroom. And also for the ordinary level too, we have got a list of topics that you can cover within your reading text, the topics that we can use. We have that, but make sure that you use a collection of enjoyable, challenging, and appropriate to the goal of your reading class. Okay, enjoyable to the learners, but then always think about the objective of your reading, the objective and competency that you want your learners to really get from the lesson that you are presenting, the reading text. And then also exploitability, so a text that facilitates the achievement of a certain language and content goal, that is exploitable for instructional tasks and techniques, and that is integratable with other skills, so such as listening, speaking, writing. Okay, so that is just to say that it should be exploitable. It should be something that the learners can really look and then investigate and then find, let's say, different language structure that you want them to see, the content that you really want them to read and know about, and maybe they will use in their writing or in their speaking, or reading that will complement the listening that they're going to do. Do you understand? So it should be exploitable for teaching techniques. For example, if you want to help them practice skimming, then it should be a text that is in that sense of to get the general idea. If it's scanning, do you get, it should be exploitable. Or if there's a certain grammatical structure that you want to look at, then you can use a text that is really exploitable, offering the grammatical structure that you want to focus on. Number 3 is the readability, a text with lexical and structural difficulty that will challenge the learners without overwhelming them. It shouldn't be too easy, then they'll be bored, and it shouldn't be too difficult, then they'll be overwhelmed by the text. So it should be at the the level of difficulty should be either lexical or structural difficulty should be manageable within the proficiency of the learners that you're working with. Okay, and then we are moving on to the 4th reading principle, that is encourage the development of reading strategies. We have looked at some of the reading strategies earlier. You have to encourage and you have to focus on these reading strategies within your lessons, and then practice the reading strategy within your lesson with your learners. All right, show them how to. All right, have them practice that reading strategy that you are focusing on in your lesson. Okay, so this is just a question that you need to think about. To what extent are you encouraging your learners to use all these strategies that you have, like the ones that we have already looked at? And then that is really dependent on the syllabus, all right, and the objective and the competency that you want to their learners to focus on that in that specific lesson. Okay, and then include both the bottom up and the top down techniques. All right, it's very important that we focus on having the learners really use both the bottom up and the top down techniques. I know we want really our learners to really communicate, all right, and then we want them to use authentic language activities within the classroom. But then we just sometimes forget about the fundamentals, like things like the top down, top down and bottom up thinking processes or techniques within the lesson. So it's really important to focus on building on this. So what is bottom up and top down? We are going to look at a short clip that is explaining what top down and bottom up processes are. So we have got it here.
Hi, I'm James, and I am the Head of Teacher Training at Renner International, and today I wanted to talk about listening and reading comprehension. What's important to consider with both listening and reading, which are receptive skills, is how we process information. And there's two different types of processing. There's bottom-up processing and top-down processing. Bottom-up processing is where you start at the basic elements. For listening, it's sounds. For reading, it's letters. And from that, construct words. From words, sentences, paragraphs, or extended listenings. And from those sounds, letters, words, we construct meaning. This is the traditional way of focusing on reading and listening comprehension. However, we also process information top-down. This means that we use a lot of contextual information, a lot of our background knowledge to process what we listen and what we read, what we listen to and what we read. So it's important that when you're teaching listening and reading that you give students access to both types of processing. This is why it's important before students read or listen that the context is set, that any background knowledge, relevant background knowledge is activated. You can also do prediction tasks, because when we read and when we listen, we're naturally constantly using all of that information and making instant predictions, constant predictions as we listen and read, and having them verified by the information we receive from the bottom-up processing. So in order to fully develop students' listening skills and reading skills, it's important to give students access to both those types of processing. I hope you find this tip helpful and have fun with your reading and listening lessons. Thanks.
All right, next, the other principle that you have to consider when you're teaching reading is to build a strong vocabulary base. Okay? An extensive vocabulary is very important for all aspects of language use, none more so than reading, all right? So when they have high level of vocabulary usage and knowledge and understanding, it does not only help with their reading, but it's very, very important for them when they are reading. And then the more limited the learner is with their vocabulary, for example, the less will he be, or will his or her ability to communicate will be. All right, so that's why it's very important for us to really build on the vocabulary. And I think vocabulary is also related to the point that we have just looked at, the bottom down processing when it comes to reading. Okay, but I just thought that we should also emphasize on that, because we want to build the vocabulary of our learners so that they can understand what they are reading, they can express themselves when they are writing and speaking as well, and then when they are listening too, they will not have so much of difficulty. All right. Theory and research has shown that extensive reading is one of the most effective ways for developing rich vocabulary, and I think I've mentioned that earlier. It's through extensive reading that we can help or encourage our learners to develop or build their vocabulary abilities. And then in deciding which words to teach and how to teach them, Anderson recommends that we ask ourselves the following questions, which have been taken from recognition. All right, so what vocabulary do learners need to know? Because it's gonna, in some ways, going to contribute with their understanding of the reading text they are focusing on in the classroom. Number 2, how will they learn this vocabulary? What type of activities are they going to do? Do you want them to do an activity that has been prepared, or do they come up with their activities themselves? Like, how are they going to learn this vocabulary? So are they going to use the dictionary? Are they going to use the Concord? What are they going to use? How will they learn it? And then how can I best test to see that they know the word and what they now know? All right, so you have to now decide which activities, or how are you going to assess whether the learners know this vocabulary already, or if there is a need to really see that they understood the word that they are focusing on. So these are some of the decisions that you have to make when you are thinking about building the vocabulary of the learners. I mean, certain vocabulary that you want to focus on within the reading. Okay. Moving on to the next reading strategies is follow the sequence SQ 3Rs. One effective series of produces of approaching a reading text has come to be labeled the SQ3R technique, a process consisting of the following 5 steps. So we have got survey, so SQ3Rs. All right, survey, which is skimming the text for an overview of the main ideas. And then question, the reader asks questions about what he or she wishes to get out of the text after they have reviewed. So they come up with their own questions, basically. All right, what do they want to get out of those questions? And then they need to then read the text while looking for answers to the previous formulated questions. So the questions that they come up with here, these are the ones that they need to answer. All right, and then recite, process the salient points in the text through oral or written language. So that is just to say, the main ideas, some of the standing out ideas that they got from the text. They could do that orally, or they could do that through writing. And then review, assess the importance of what one has just read and incorporate it into the long-term association. So this is just reviewing, really fermenting the information that they got from the text. And then it could be, discussing related topics to what they have read, so that they associate it to the long-term component in their brains. Okay, and then the most important information that they got from the text. And then you can guide them. They can decide on what those important aspects are, or you can guide them on seeing which are their most important tasks, important points from the text, and then associating them with what they already know regarding either the structure or the content, similar topics that are related to the text that they have done. But remember, though, that when it comes to this technique, you don't have to follow all of them or follow them according to this sequence, but just choose the ones that you think are appropriate or are going to be applicable within your lesson. All right, just know that it does not fit all the classes all the time, but this is a good technique actually for when they are starting, and then you can give them with that, or you can practice it as it is in the lesson, or you can use some of the steps that you think are appropriate in the context in which you are focusing on, and also based on the objective and the competencies that you want them to focus on that you have gotten from your syllabus. Now the question is, in an L2 class, have you ever taken L2 class that you have already taken? Okay, do you recall the usage of the SQ3R ever being used in your lessons? Have you tried this sequence on in your own teaching before and in your own lesson planning? If not, how about trying using them? And then the question is now, how rigidly would you adhere to the sequence That is, what variation might you employ in that approaching a reading text. So do you use them as they are, as like survey, question, review? What is the other one again? Read, recite, and review. Do you follow it that way, or do you change it up? Okay, do you follow it as it is, or do you change it up? So those are just some of the questions, the classroom connection questions that you can think about when you are teaching the lesson. And then the next one that we have, the principle is design pre-reading, while reading, and post-reading phases. So within your lessons, you need to use these 3 different phases. Okay. It's tempting, especially in intermediate and advanced levels, to tell your learners, okay, now class, read the next 2 pages silently. You don't have any introduction, no hints on anything special to do while reading, no, so nary means no thought about something to follow the silent reading period. So we have a tendency of like really just saying, okay, go ahead and read. But this is not good. That's why they say that when you are teaching or when you're designing your lesson plan, have the 3 phases, right? A good rubric to keep in mind when you are teaching reading is following the 3-part framework. So the pre-reading, before they start reading, do some sort of activity or task. While they're reading, what activities or tasks that do they need to do while they are during their reading part? And then the post-reading, like after they have read, what do they then need to do? All right, but we'll cover this in part 3 in more details, like what is it all about, so we don't need to spend more time there right now. And the last principle that you have to consider is build ongoing informal assessment in your techniques. So it means that you really need to have the assessment component, like really assess to see that they have comprehended what they are reading. Okay, so because reading, like listening comprehension, is totally unobservable, you don't know if they are really reading. They might be seemingly focused on their reading, but their minds are not concentrated on the reading that you have have in front of them. So we have to infer comprehension from other behaviors. So it is as important in reading as it is in listening to be able to accurately assess the learner's comprehension and development of the skills. All right. So consider the following overt responses, because reading is not something that you cannot go into the learner's mind and see if they're really reading. So there are other behaviors that you can focus on to really grasp or get their understanding, that can indicate their understanding. So here we have them. We have 9 of them. So doing. The reader responds physically to a command that is given in a reading. And then choosing. So the reader selects from alternative posed, oral, or in writing. So like you have multiple choice, and then they can choose responses, select responses that you want them to select that indicates that they understood what they were reading. Transferring, the reader summarizes orally what they have read. Answering, the reader answers questions about the passage. Condensing, the reader outlines or take notes of, on a passage, like the important aspects that you want them to take note of. Extending, the reader provides an ending to a story, for example. Duplicating, the reader translates the message into their native language or copies it. And beginning levels, when you are working with beginning levels, which we really don't have, or maybe you might find yourself working with beginning levels at some center, then you should give them short passages. Modeling, the reader puts together a toy, for example, after reading directions for assembly, or it could be let's say a recipe. After they've read it, then they put pictures together based on the reading, like what comes first in the recipe, using pictures, all right, to represent what has been written in the text, and then put them in order to show their understanding of what has been written in the recipe, for example. That's just an example. And then conversing, the readers engage in a conversation that indicates appropriate processing of information, like that shows that they really understood. Right, so that's what we have there. Okay, so far we have covered in part 2, what did we cover? We have covered the types of classroom reading performance, and then we started off with the strategies that we have not finished, so strategy 9 and 10 that we didn't finish in the classroom last class, and then we looked at the types of classroom reading performance and the principles that you need to consider when you are teaching reading, right? And then in the next class, part 3, we are going to look at the 3 phases of teaching reading. So pre-reading, while reading, and post-reading. And then part 4, this is what we're going to cover in part 4. That, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of part 2. Thank you.